Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What is the creepiest true story someone has ever told you? Story 1. Recurring dream became reality.
My grandmother had a recurring nightmare throughout her entire life. In this dream, she would walk down a long dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. However, she would always wake up before seeing what it was. When she was in her 40s, she went on vacation with her husband, my dad, and my aunt. They booked the hotel at the last minute, which resulted in them having to get 2 rooms with twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. At around 3 a.m., my dad woke up suddenly, sensing something was not right. He called out into the darkness, "Dad?" But there was no response. He turned on the bedside light and called out again, louder this time, "Dad?" Still there was no answer. Alarmed, he slid out of bed and shook his father, but he did not wake up. Panicking, my dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandmother's room and started banging on her door. When she opened the door, clearly worried, my dad shouted, "Something's wrong with Dad." He led her down the hallway, a long dark hallway, to the last door on the left. My grandmother reached the door, turned to the left, and saw her husband lying dead in bed from a heart attack. She never had the nightmare again.
Story 2. Final goodbye.
When I was around 7 years old, my grandmother began taking care of a baby named John. John's mother was struggling with severe alcoholism and drug addiction, often leaving him at my grandmother's house for months at a time without any notice or communication. Over time, our family grew deeply attached to John, treating him as one of our own. To us, he was not just a child in need. He was family. One evening, John's mother came to pick him up after one of her extended absences. She was with her boyfriend, who was visibly intoxicated. Despite our family's concerns, she insisted on taking John home. Tragically, on their way back, the boyfriend lost control of the car, flipping it in a terrible accident. John was critically injured and rushed to the hospital. He fell into a coma, and for 3 or 4 days we clung to hope, praying for his recovery. On the 3rd night, something chilling happened. My older brother, who shared a room with me, woke the entire household with loud screams and uncontrollable sobbing. He was inconsolable, crying out that John is dead. Once our parents managed to calm him enough to speak, he told us something that left us all frozen. He said John had come into his room, crying. According to my brother, John looked scared and told him, "I have to leave, but I do not want to go alone. Please come with me." My parents tried their best to reassure my brother, telling him it was just a bad dream brought on by the stress of the situation. But even as they spoke, the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, as if something unexplainable was happening. Then, as if on cue, the phone rang. It was my uncle, calling from the hospital. The doctors had done everything they could, but John had just passed away. The room fell silent. My parents, who had just been trying to comfort my brother, were now at a loss for words. My grandmother sobbed quietly, and my brother sat there, pale and shaking. He insisted he had not been dreaming, that John had really come to him. For him, it was not just a dream, but a final goodbye. Even now, more than 30 years later, the memory of that night gives me chills. Whether it was a supernatural event, a vivid dream, or something else entirely, it is an experience none of us can fully explain or forget. John's brief presence in our lives left a profound and lasting impact, reminding us of the unbreakable bonds we had formed with him in such a short time.
Story 3. My daughter's eerie visitor.
When my eldest daughter was 4 years old, something strange began happening in her shared bedroom. It started one evening when I was downstairs and heard muffled voices coming from their room. I paused to listen, but could not make out what was being said. Curious and slightly concerned, I made my way upstairs to check on them. As I approached their room, the voices stopped. I figured I had startled them. I opened the door and found my 4-year-old daughter sitting up in bed, while her little sister, who was 3 at the time, was still lying down. I smiled, trying to put them at ease, and asked, "Is everything okay?" My eldest nodded, but before she could say more, her younger sister interjected, complaining, "They are keeping me up." "They? Who are they?" I asked, puzzled. My 4-year-old apologized softly and said, "I was just talking." "Talking to who?" I pressed gently. Before she could answer, my 3-year-old sat up, pointed toward the window, and said something that sent chills down my spine. "The girl in the window. She said you were coming." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Gathering myself, I asked them to explain. They both described a girl who came to their window at night and spoke to them. My mind raced. How could this be? Was it an imaginary friend or something more unsettling? Not wanting to scare them, I tucked them back into bed, wished them good night, and stepped outside their door to listen for any further sounds. The rest of the night was quiet, but I could not shake the eerie feeling that lingered. The next day I casually brought it up again, asking my eldest if the girl had returned. She nodded and told me the girl was back, but seemed upset. I asked why she was upset, but my daughter did not know. Her matter-of-fact tone unsettled me even more. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it, thinking it was just a passing phase or an overactive imagination. But then my wife mentioned something that reignited my unease. One evening she asked, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed upstairs, my heart pounding, and found both girls sitting under the window, staring up at it. When they noticed me, they turned and smiled, asking excitedly, "Do you want to meet the girl?" I was speechless, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, they turned back toward the window, and their expressions fell. Disappointed, they told me she left. For the next week, I kept a close eye on them and their room, but the girl in the window seemed to vanish as suddenly as she had appeared. I asked my daughters occasionally if she had returned, but they would simply shake their heads. As time went on, the strange events faded into memory. It has now been 5 years since that unsettling period, and neither of my daughters has mentioned the girl in the window again. To this day, I do not know what it was. An overactive imagination, a shared dream, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it still sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it.
Story 4. Someone breathing.
Paranormal activity has always been a strange concept to me. From a scientific standpoint, I tend to disregard it. But growing up in a house where unexplainable things occurred, I can't help but wonder. I try not to think too much about it, much like how the universe has no edge. So, about this house, it was an old house in New Zealand, and my family lived there for about 5 years. During that time, there were many eerie and unexplained events. We had the usual things, like doors slamming when there was no breeze. Many times my sisters and I would hear footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. One night, our family was suddenly awoken by a loud crash. We all rushed to find the source of the noise and discovered that a vase had smashed on the floor in the middle of the bathroom. The vase had been sitting on the windowsill above the sink, and if it had simply fallen, it would have shattered in the sink. But instead, it bypassed the sink and smashed about 7 feet into the middle of the room. My mother often claimed to have woken up feeling as though someone was breathing on her face. But the scariest experience I had was one night when I woke up in my room. My bed was in the middle of the room, and I could distinctly hear a man breathing heavily, as if he were lying on the floor next to my bed. I was only 7 years old at the time, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. I had a few asthma attacks before, and tried to convince myself it was just me breathing strangely, but after holding my breath for a long time, I could still hear this man's breathing. I was too scared to look at the floor, but fortunately, it wasn't between me and the door. After what felt like forever, I finally gathered the courage to get out of bed and ran, screaming and crying, to my parents' bedroom. I spent the rest of the night sleeping in my mum's bed.
Story 5. The Haunted House.
When I was a child, we moved into a new house. My earliest memory is that my brother's room was always cold, but I never thought much about it. As I got older, I moved into that room, but it wasn't cold anymore. I asked my mum why the room was so cold, and she told me that when we first moved in, my sister actually took that room. She had many nightmares, and when she woke up, there were bruises on her legs and stomach. My mum also experienced nightmares where a woman would tell her to leave the house. My mum performed a ritual or something similar, and everything stopped, including the room not being cold anymore. A few years later, my sister was getting married. My grandma and 3 female cousins I had never met before came to stay at our house. My mum mentioned that grandma didn't like staying there because she always got sick when she visited. My 3 cousins stayed in my sister's old room, and after the second night they were there, they became really scared. They said that someone had been trying to open their door. They kept seeing the doorknob jiggling, and when they opened it, no one was there. They came to my room and asked if they could sleep in there. I thought they were trying to scare me, but I played along. I slept on the floor, and they took the bunk bed. Suddenly I heard the washing machine turn on. The laundry room was next to my room, so I went out there and turned it off. Then I went back to my room, and outside my door I heard chains dragging across the floor. But when I opened the door, no one was there. This freaked me out because for all the years I had lived there, nothing like this had ever happened. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning I went to my sister's old room to check things out because I was curious. When I opened the door, I saw 2 things that really freaked me out. There were faint black marks on the ceiling, like footsteps, and the window was open. What was scary about the window being open? Someone had installed the second glass of the window incorrectly, so it could only be opened from the outside. We lived on the second floor, and it was impossible to open unless you had a ladder. This freaked me out for a while. After everyone left, nothing weird happened again. I talked to my mom about it later, and she said the house didn't like new people, especially females. This explained why I had never seen or experienced anything except for the cold room, and why my grandma always got sick. After that, from time to time when I was sleeping, I would hear a baby crying. I assumed it was my neighbor's baby, but didn't think much of it. When we moved out, my mom insisted I go say goodbye to all our neighbors, even though I never talked to them. When I said goodbye to the family next door that I thought had the crying baby, I asked how their baby was doing. They said they didn't have a baby. About 7 years after I moved away from the house, I went back to visit. When I went to my old room, it had changed a lot and was bigger. I asked the current owner why it was bigger, and they said the closet in the room had a hidden space behind it, making the closet twice the size. I asked them if they had found anything in there, and they said no. I don't know if this had anything to do with the strange things I experienced, but it was just another weird thing I learned about the house years later. Also, the window next to my room is the laundry room.
Story 6. A strange disappearance.
About 1.5 years ago, my best friend of over 15 years and I took a trip to my family farm at night after getting out of our second shift jobs. It was a nice, clear, crisp early fall night in Michigan. We were sitting there, just chatting away and watching the night sky when he asked a very peculiar question. He said, "This place has always had a strange feel to it, almost like you're being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean." I just laughed a little, and I replied that I only knew the stories my father told me. I told him about how, when my great-grandfather purchased the farm in the early 1930s, it became a big family project to keep it up and running. Relatives would come and help with the chores, and in exchange, they were allowed to hunt the land for food. My great-grandfather had a cousin who came over one day, helped out, and asked if he could go coon hunting later that night. He, of course, got permission and set out shortly after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandfather noticed that his cousin's vehicle was still in the driveway, even though he should have left hours before. It was still dark out, but my great-grandfather knew the area where his cousin would be hunting and set off in that direction. He walked toward the back pasture field, and as he came around a bend, he called out his cousin's name. He heard a strange, yet familiar voice answer him back. He said that the voice chilled him to the bone, that something wasn't quite right about it. So he called out again, and this time, the voice was definitely not his cousin's, but almost like a growl, imitating his voice. He said he quickly ran out of there, never looking back. When the sun came up, he gathered a group of relatives and farm hands to look for him. They found his cousin's gun, loaded but not fired, his hat, which was covered in a brown liquid splattering, and that was all. My great-grandfather searched for him for over 60 years. The only time he ever held out hope of finding him, my dad said, was when the swamp in the pasture field by where he was supposed to be hunting dried up. Needless to say, there's more to this story, but as I've already written quite a long post, I'll leave it here for now.
Story 7. Ghost of a Mother.
About a month or so after my friend's mother passed away, he shared an eerie experience. She died of a heart attack while taking a walk in their back garden, with no suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. Everything seemed normal at their house for about a month. Then my friend began to notice strange happenings. The garden where she had died became unhealthy, and all the plants seemed to die, even though they were still being watered regularly. On top of that, odd noises started occurring throughout the house, including the sounds of things being knocked over. One night he was woken by one of these noises, so he decided to walk to the kitchen to get a drink of water to calm himself down. As he turned the corner, he swears he saw his mother standing at the stove cooking something. He could even smell the food. The apparition of his mother turned around, smiled at him, and then walked toward the back door, beckoning him to follow. Though terrified, my friend followed her. The ghost led him to the exact spot in the garden where she had passed away, and stood there for about 10 minutes. During that time, my friend just stood there quietly, trying not to be too scared. Eventually, the apparition disappeared. My friend stayed there for a few minutes just to be sure, and then returned inside to try and fall back asleep. The next morning, he convinced himself it had been a bad dream. When he went outside to the garden, however, he found something strange. In the exact spot where the ghost had stood, 5 roses had grown, one for each family member: his friend, his sister, his older brother, their father, and even one for the dog. At first, I didn't believe him. That was until he sent me a picture of the roses surrounded by the dead plants. I wish I still had the picture, but this took place almost 6 months ago. Thinking back on it still gives me chills. I can't even imagine what it's like for him.
Story 8. My father became a monster.
In this story, the narrator talks about growing up in a typical middle-class American family. Loving parents, siblings, dogs, and all the usual things. One night, the child has a nightmare where they are being chased by something, possibly ghosts, and in the dream, they find their father and jump into his arms for comfort. But when the child looks up at their father, instead of his familiar face, they see a grotesque, skinless gorilla face with exposed muscle and bone grinning down at them. The child wakes up scared and sweaty, and the next morning, while having breakfast, they look at their father, who smiles at them. This smile reassures them. The most chilling part of the story comes here. That was the last time I saw my father as the man that I knew and loved. After that, he turned into a monster. Over the next summer, the father's behavior dramatically changes. He becomes abusive and controlling, manipulating the family and others around him. Eventually, the father creates a cult-like environment within the family. The narrator describes growing up in this toxic, terrifying environment and eventually escapes once they reach adulthood. Whether this story is true or not, it has stayed with many readers, leaving a lasting impression because of how it illustrates the terrifying transformation of a loved one into something unrecognizable and monstrous.
Story 9. Floating Children.
To begin with, I am as non-religious as it gets, and like any typical Redditor, I don't believe in anything science can't explain to some extent. This is my only experience that still makes me question myself. I was around 6 years old at our old house. I shared a room with my sister at the time. both of our beds touched the same wall and were separated by a nightstand. The room was square in shape and attached to the rest of the house via a longish corridor. My sister was around 4 at the time. I woke up sometime during the night, not sure when. I couldn't tell time. And it must have been late, since no one was awake and the highway from my room sounded empty of cars. As I fiddled about in my bed, I opened my eyes and looked towards my ceiling. I saw 2 small children floating about 4 feet away from me. They were greenish in color, and their edges were not well defined from the space around them. They giggled as they noticed me noticing them. I couldn't tell if that was a safe giggle. I decided I must still be shaky from sleep and closed my eyes to continue sleeping, hoping they would disappear. I reopened my eyes, and they were still there, slightly closer. I got really scared. I repeated closing my eyes, but each time I opened them, they were closer. Now they were about 2.5 feet away. I jumped out of my bed and ran towards the door, heading into the hallway. I paused at the door to look behind me. They gasped as I ran, and when I looked back, they had turned their heads to face me. I ran again, this time heading for my mom's bedroom. I jumped into her bed, shaking, and slept there. To this day, I regret leaving my sister in there, but I was too afraid to do anything else. I've told very few people about this. A cousin of a friend of mine independently told me a story she experienced as a child too. Without any knowledge of my experience, she described the little floating children she saw as dim glowing green. I hate remembering this story.
Story 10. Driving into the unknown.
As someone who is caught between a strong Christian upbringing and reconciling all of that with my current agnostic-ish views, I've always wondered what happened on this night. In Beaumont, Texas, there is a place called Saratoga or Bragg Road, known for its paranormal history. I've gone there a number of times with my family, and sometimes you see something, and other times you don't. However, one night we went there, and it was decidedly different. Our group piled into one truck for this trip. I was probably 16 at the time. It was me and my, at the time, stepdad in the truck bed, and my brother, mother, 2 cousins, and aunt in the cabin. We had decided to go to Bragg Road because it was a happenstance occasion. We all happened to be in town on a Wednesday night when none of us had to be anywhere the next day. We figured that nobody would be out there, which tends to improve your chances of seeing something. The way things work on Saratoga Road is you drive slowly down the 1-lane dirt road, and if you want to, you double back and drive it again. On our first run through, we didn't see anything remotely paranormal, though we did pass by a sketchy group of young college-aged men and women who had pulled over into a small clearing in the swamp and were just leaving their car. They gave us some unfriendly looks, as if we were intruding. Well, we decided to drive back down the road a second time just to see what we could see. By this time, we had completely forgotten about the other group of people. We get to their little impromptu campsite, and they had done some remodeling, so to speak. They had erected some kind of pole with a pentagram painted on an affixed sign and were standing around a campfire, talking softly to themselves. Remember those unfriendly looks from earlier? We got them 100-fold then. So we passed by the creepy group, with my stepdad and I being the only 2 truly face-to-face with them. The others could just close their windows. Not 2 minutes later, we suddenly start hearing crackling noises. My stepdad pushed my arm anxiously and pointed up to the treetop, saying, "Holy cow, look." Lo and behold, there were bluish-white motes of light, about 2 or 3 feet in diameter, rapidly fluttering about the treetops. They stopped for a moment, hovering about 20 feet above us before suddenly descending, freaking out harder than I ever have before or since. My stepdad and I began banging on the window, screaming, "Drive, drive." My aunt, the driver, stopped the car to ask what we were so freaked out about, prompting us to scream even louder. So we did our best to stay calm as we suddenly sped from 10 miles per hour to about 50 miles per hour on this narrow, one-lane dirt road. The lights continued to follow us, getting closer all the time and making this noise. I can't really describe it as anything but disturbing. It had some kind of high-pitched, ethereal quality to it, but it just felt alien. In the sense of not normal, of course. When we reached the end of the road, we all hurried to our respective cars as quickly as possible. We regrouped at a gas station a few miles away and compared stories. Everybody saw the same thing and heard the same noise. I don't believe we've been back since.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.